So when I think about handling conflict, and it's interesting that the topic wasn't actually set up as resolving conflict, but rather handling conflict. I think it's because we all deal with it. And the way that we step into conflict really is something that determines in no small part how we experience our days and our lives, because there's opportunity for it around us more or less all day, all the time. Conflicts also bring incredible opportunities for possibility and for resolution. And I think that's what we're all looking for when we think about conflict, is how do I resolve this? And the good news, bad news is that many times it can be resolved in really powerful, constructive, positive, healthy ways. Sometimes, like you get to a point where you do what you need to do, you say what you need to say, you engage in the way that feels aligned with who you are, your values and beliefs, and you still don't come to a really satisfying resolution. And it's about how you stepped into the process that allows you to step back out of it in a way that makes you feel still in integrity. And I was really thinking about this because I think, there are so many different common rules and like ways to approach and tenets and principles. And I'll probably share some of those that you may have heard from others and maybe from other growth coaches. I'll probably share a bit of a different take as well. That as we come into the second half of our coaching session today, I'm actually going to share what I call my 7 rules of engagement. But before we get there, what I want to talk about is something a little bit different, something that I feel like is really, really relevant and important to any conflict situation, but we often don't think about. And because we don't think about it, we don't have the opportunity to understand how it influences any particular interaction, and then how to work with certain elements of conflict in a way that allows us to create the structure, the container that would create the most meaningful and positive and mutual outcome for those involved. And that thing that I want to talk about is something I call modes of engagement. And there are these 4 modes of engagement that are a part of not just every conflict, but every way that we actually step into and interact with other human beings. We can engage in these 4 different levels. And they are massively important to our ability to just flourish as human beings. But they really, really come into play in a powerful way in conflict situations. So I want to talk about these 4 different modes of engagement, how they play a role in conflict situations, and how they really help us either handle them well or not well at all, distill them down to a single principle that I think is really powerful, that derives out of those 4 modes of engagement. And then once we get through that principle, I'm going to talk about these 7 sort of fairly straightforward rules of engagement. So what are these modes of engagement that I'm talking about? Modes that we step into conversation, interactions, engaging with other human beings. Well, the first one is what I call scale. And this is about whether you are interacting with somebody on a one-to-one level, a one-to-some level, or a one-to-many level, right? So one-to-one is just, like you and another human being in some form of interaction or conversation. One-to-some, in my mind, can be anywhere from, like 2, 3, 4 people, where there's, like still some level of intimacy in the conversation. And one-to-many starts to be when we're scaling up beyond that. And this could be dozens, it could be hundreds of people, it could be thousands of people. And in fact, you would say, well, how can one person be in potential conversation and conflict with thousands or even millions of people? Witness social media. It is sort of like the fundamental example of this dynamic. So first we think about, okay, so what is the scale of the interaction and the potential conflict? Is it a one-to-one thing? Is it a one-to-something? Or is it a one-to-many thing, right? Then we have this thing I call presence. That's the second mode of engagement. And that's about whether it's in person or remote, The third mode of engagement here is what I call synchronicity. That's about whether it's happening in real time, it's synchronous, or whether it's spread out over a window of time. That would be asynchronous, right? And then the final mode of engagement is what I call exposure. And that's about how public versus private it is, right? And again, this is about both interactions, but it's also about conflict. Is the conflict one-to-one, one-to-some, one-to-many? Is it a conflict situation where it's in person or remote? Is it happening in real time, or is it happening unfolding over like a window of time? And is it massively public? Is it somewhere in the middle, or is it very private? Each one of these four different modes has both advantages and disadvantages when it comes to conflict. And we can blend them to either make it much easier to resolve a conflict or make it nearly impossible to move through a conflict scenario and have anything resembling a satisfying outcome. So let's talk about scale, right? And I said, this is whether you're in one-to-one, one-to-some, one-to-many. The benefit of a more intimate, right? It's almost about intimacy. When you're one-to-one or even one-to-some in a really a small group of people, it can be fairly intimate. And that level of intimacy makes it easier to speak to the unique needs and pick up nuance and create the safety that so often is critical in being able to have people open up and be honest and be truthful and be vulnerable in a way that seeds the foundation of a deeper level of empathy and understanding and eventually resolution. When you start to move to the other side, to one-to-some, and then eventually you cross that scale to the one-to-many, we see the opposite happening, right? So now we are trying to relate to a mass of people. And maybe there are a lot of people who you're in conflict. Maybe it's a massive community. Maybe it's a following. Maybe it's just a lot of people who disagree with you. It could be political affiliations these days. It could be social affiliations, faith-based affiliations, whatever it may be. There may be mass numbers of people who you find yourself in conflict with. And to have any sort of scenario where you can actually resolve a conflict in a way that feels in integrity and meaningful and constructive and nourishing to you, it's been my experience that it gets harder and harder and harder to do that the more you move out to the one-to-many, and then those numbers scale bigger and bigger and bigger. It becomes harder and harder and harder to actually create this scenario for a meaningful resolution of any kind of conflict when you get into that situation. We start to see what we call crowd mentality. This is psychologically really well-documented phenomenon where people are no longer just interested in the actual issue that drew them into conflict, but within a larger crowd of people, they also then become self-interested in posturing for both belonging and power within the larger group, and will be much more likely to adopt stances that aren't necessarily part of the fundamental conflict, but are actually more representative of the things that they believe will allow them to attain a deep level of belonging and a high level of power and status within a group. And that adds a layer of complexity to any sort of conflict that makes it so much more difficult to reach a meaningful resolution. So you see this a lot of times also where things start out in conflict, and there's a large scale conflict, and there are large numbers that are involved in that. And the only time it actually comes into a meaningful process of resolution is when representatives of larger numbers decide that they come together and then sit down at a table. What we're essentially doing is we're taking that one-to-many dynamic or many-to-many dynamic, and we're realizing that that tends to be an utter disaster when it comes to handling conflict and reaching any sort of meaningful resolution. Human nature realizes this. And what we do is we've developed a process where we start to say, well, okay, so if anything's going to happen here, it can't be thousands of people shouting at each other from both sides. We need people to represent our interests, like one or two or three people to sit down in a more intimate way.
The biggest part of handling conflict starts with you, and it starts with you being well. And that's really where I'm going to dive in today, with really learning to handle conflict from taking radical responsibility. So I want you all to write that down, radical responsibility. And you might think in conflict, most of the time we think in conflict, we think of what someone did to us, how they said something, how they treated us. And we've talked in my other sessions about transformational letter writing and forgiveness. And we talked a little bit about how to deal with conflict before when we talked about relationships and things like that. But today I really want to get to the nitty gritty of how to handle conflict. And it really starts with yourself, and it really starts with using some of those tools before you actually engage, especially if the conflict is already started, or before you jump into that conflict. So first, we're going to start with the breath. First, we're going to ground down, get ourselves to a nice and relaxed place with the breath, and then we're going to get into our topic. So take a moment to put your right hand over your heart, your left hand over your right, and take a deep inhale through your nose. And exhale, sigh it out. Again, inhale through your nose. And exhale, sigh it out. This last time, inhale through your nose and hold the breath. And slowly sigh it out. All right, relax your hands down. And so that is the first step. Seriously, the first step when you get into any conflict is to breathe. Number one is to breathe, and not just regular breath, but take a deep inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. That's called circle breathing. That's the first thing that you do so that you can de-stress, so that you can calm your nervous system, and so that you can come to a more mindful place. And I'm a huge proponent of responding versus reacting. A lot of times when you go right away, like, okay, this person triggered me, or this person said something, or this person did something, you can be reacting out of fear, out of sadness, out of judgment. You can be reacting from all these other places. But when you take a moment and take a breath, then you can respond from a mindful place. Okay, the first response is just take space. And everyone is different when it comes to conflict resolution. Some people like to, no, let's hammer this out right now. What did you mean when you said this, and go right around? But one that I like is to take space. And the reason taking space is my favorite, and the one I say is number one, is because you have an opportunity to think about your feelings and how you feel and why you were triggered, because we all have different realities. And when you have a trigger, then you get an opportunity, if you take space, to just discern, okay, why am I bothered? Or if you were the person that harmed someone else, you have a moment to allow them to think about why they were bothered, right? So taking space is the number one reaction when dealing with conflict. And the reason that's my number one, because it gives you time to process your emotions and to move from a place of responding versus reacting. So let's unpack that a little bit. So in the taking space, the first thing to do is acknowledge how you feel. A lot of people's like, oh, it's fine, I'm not bothered. I mean, that was mean, that was rude, that was offensive, but no, I'm fine, right? How many of us avoid? Just be honest. How many of us are just like avoiding, like, I'm fine, I'm happy-go-lucky. We're gonna spiritually bypass the fact that, you might mention ways that it was harmful, but you say, I'm fine. Right? And so my first tip is to acknowledge how you really feel. I was offended by that. I was actually harmed by that, or that didn't resonate with me, or that made me sad, or that made me angry, or that made me feel disrespected, right? So part of, what I've taught before in the transformational letter writing, if you haven't checked out that teaching on transformational letter writing, check it out. But it's acknowledging how you really feel. You can feel more than one way at once. You can feel disrespected, but at peace. You can feel sad, but in a place of love and compassion. So you can acknowledge an emotion that you don't feel like is the highest vibration of self and still be in a place of love. So I just want to just say that right now, because I think a lot of times, especially most people on this app, we're happy-go-lucky, we're we're, positive people, positive mindset, but sometimes it's toxic positivity. Sometimes we don't want to admit when we're sad, when we're angry, when we're disappointed even, but acknowledging those emotions will actually help you respond in a better way, in a more mindful way, in a more compassionate way, in a more authentic way. Because if you respond from a place you're sad or you're offended and you say, no, it's okay, you're actually not being honest. Right? You're not being honest with yourself, and therefore you can't be honest with the other person. Like Brendon said, coming here, I just moved to Atlanta, moving into my new house, thought the internet was going to be set up yesterday. We'd be fine for today. Then I was like, okay, maybe we can knock it out in the morning. As the time started ticking, I'm like, it's not going to be up in time. I got to find a plan B. I need a plan B. And I'm like, WeWork, because before the pandemic with my Amex, I got WeWork studios. I love the studios, but I didn't need it because I work from home. And so when I got in this crunch time, I knew that you can last minute book a room on your phone, fly into the building and just have your session. So I was like, all right, it's 20 minutes away. I'm getting in my car. I'm booking it on my phone. And I got here. But instead of just, pretending like everything's okay, I'm like, okay, I'm usually 15 minutes before, I'm like 2 minutes before setting up, and Brendon's helping me, Brendon's team is helping me. And it just felt so good to be supported. But if I had beat myself up, or if Brendon had got mad at me, wait, Koya's not 15 minutes out, we're going to cancel, a lot of things that could have happened. But I acknowledge hey, so sorry, I'm running late. And this is what happened. And they came up to help me, right? So when we acknowledge where we're at, when we acknowledge how we feel, I felt embarrassed, and I wish I had my beautiful background and all the things going, but I can acknowledge that. But no matter what, I'm showing up anyway, right? So when we can acknowledge how we're feeling in every moment, when we take that space, when we come back together, we get to say, okay, this is how I felt, and this is my emotions, and then you get to see how the other person felt. Next time we talk, I would ask Brendon, like, how do you feel? Are you good? I can apologize to him and just make sure that he's okay, right? Instead of just washing over the emotion, pretending like everything's okay, acknowledging how you feel will help you respond in a better way. And now, after you acknowledge, it's important to show up with an intention. Like, my intention was to show up and shine and talk to you all about conflict resolution. So no matter what, I came here ready to do that, right? And so because my intention is clear and I just had to figure out where I was going to do it and make sure I had internet, the intention is super clear. So when you have a conflict, a lot of times you can think, well, that person's trying to harm me. You get so confused thinking about why they did what they did or why they said what they said. You forget your intention. Right? So your intention is most important. Why are you in relationship with them? Why are you working with them? Why are they your friend anyway? If they're your family member, why do you love them? And why are they important in your life? So it's important when you get frustrated or when you have conflict to remember, after you acknowledge how you feel, remember, why are you there in the first place?
Today in Growth Day, we are taking on the topic of handling conflict better. I know this is such an important topic because sometimes your relationships, they start falling apart. Sometimes some at work has you frustrated. Sometimes you find yourself getting an argument after argument. Sometimes you feel like hooked or triggered emotionally by what other people are doing. And you figure, like, how do I handle this better? Because conflict and crises aren't going away, because building relationships are never easy. And so we have to ask the tough questions of how do we get better, knowing that those things will always be there? How do we manage our internal state, our own personal development better, so that we can be in the moment, be present, and solve things versus making them worse? Okay. My first teaching point today will cover the themes of almost everything else I'm going to teach today. So it's 3 simple phrases. Okay. 3 simple phrases. If you ask me, Brendon, help me manage conflict better for the rest of my life, you get, 3 phrases. Here is what they are. First phrase is shared future mindset. You know, when we enter conflicts, it's so often we get so myopic. We take things personally and we just want to win. So we want to just crush and trounce the other person and debate them and make them look dumb because our ego wants to be right. And we forget we got to wake up with that person tomorrow morning. Maybe that's your spouse. We got to go to work with that person again tomorrow because it's Tuesday. We got to, see that person again in our neighborhood. That person who we're about to have a conflict with, they're probably going to be there again. And once we can realize, oh, I'm entering a conflict. This is about to get, heated up. We're about to have some debate here, or you're already in it. If you can adopt the shared future mindset that, oh, we're going to share a future together. I'm going to have to see her again. I'm going to have to work with this person again. I'm going to have to deal with this probably again and again through multiple more projects in the future. Everything will shift. You'll approach the conversation differently, more strategically, more thoughtfully when you keep the future in mind. Usually what happens in the moment of conflict, we just throw out the baby with the bathwater or whatever that phrase is. I don't even know. I still don't know. Why would you say that? But you understand what I'm saying? What happens is you just toss out the whole relationship because you're mad. And the ego goes into self-identity, disconnects from the other person and from the future, and just gets in fight and flight mode. From that place, we've already lost. So deciding and determining we're going to have a shared future mindset is important. And importantly, if we're talking about relationship or partner or spousal, conflict, somebody who you really love, if the two of you have in mind, a compelling future together, right? You have shared interests, shared goals, shared adventures coming up. If you can always ground your relationships in the reality that you're building something together, if that pre-exists, then moving into a conflict, you're more likely to resolve it more quickly and amicably, right? Research shows even just having a couple have a conversation about something they're interested in doing or something good coming up in their future before having them talk out a difficulty makes that difficulty or that conversation of conflict so much more smooth, so much more short, so much less accusatory. It changes everything. Grounding ourselves in the future, I think is important. Starting off the bat with relationships, thinking, I'll work with this person again. I'll see this person. I'll care about this person again. It can change everything and can really shift everything. The second phrase I would say here is respectful process. How many of you have ever been in a conversation, in a conflict, and you were just trying to be thoughtful and try to be calm, and the person you're dealing with was not respectful? All right. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of hands raised here in the Zoom, at least as we're doing this. It's very, very frustrating. And soon as we lose respect in the conversation process, all is fair game in war. And so it's a very challenging thing. We have to go into conflict situations, but adopt this philosophy overall. I'm going to treat people with kindness and respect, even if they don't treat you that way. For those who don't know my background a little bit, this is a topic I really love because, if you don't know, my master's degree was in communication studies, and I focus mostly on leadership communication. And in that process, though, I got to do a lot of mediation, and including peer mediation. So I was mediating, students in college having conflicts. I was mediating, professors and students, administrators and professors, local community members and administrators. Like, my job was literally two people come in a room, they are in conflict, they cannot resolve it, they've already tried, they do not like each other, and here they are. I even did some court referred mediation, which in like a divorce case, they'd bring in the couple and I'd have to work with them. And mind you, I'm in my early 20s. And it was such a great training ground. I mean, for 2 years, I just got to see how terribly disrespectful people can be toward each other, even when they both want to solve it. And a big part of mediation was teaching people in advance of a conversation that this process, we were going to keep respectful, that the expectation was that this is going to be a respectful conversation, because otherwise we couldn't solve it. And they already usually knew that. I've done a lot of coaching, as you know, over the last 15 years. I'm a certified high performance coach. And over these 15 years doing it full time every single week, a lot of times I'm dealing with conflict situations and couples, or conflict situations between co-founders. And soon as it devolves into disrespect, it is 10 times harder to pull it back. It is so much more difficult. And so you'll hear me talk about how you can maintain that respectful stance with your partner or the person you're having conflict with, but also know that the expectation has to be had in advance of the conversation. Sometimes you react in the heat of the moment without stepping back and setting the frame for the conversation. As simple as, if you feel hooked or triggered, saying, could we talk about this in like 30 minutes in a much more calm way? I just need to go reset. And coming back with the expectation and the conversation. Let's try this again. I want to be more respectful with you. I know that we love and care for each other, or I know that we need to work together, or I know that it hasn't been easy. So let's try this again. Let's try to do this with kindness and care for another, and we can solve this together. I know we can. A simple reset into the frame of respect can change the outcome as well. And the third phrase, so the first phrase was shared future mindset. The last phrase was respectful process. The third one is empathy and encouragement. Now, we all know about empathy, right? We all know we're supposed to listen, understand, feel, sense their thoughts and feelings. We're supposed to reflect back how they're feeling and what they're going through. We're supposed to validate, maybe not their beliefs, but validate them as a person. We're supposed to really feel their pain or walk in their shoes. You've heard these phrases before, right? Empathy, people know they should do that. But in conflict, common sense is not always common practice. And that's why we really wreck relationships. And empathy is one of those. Being an empathetic listener, we'll talk about how, is so important. But notice the phrase, empathy and encouragement. Do you know what in conflict also goes out the window? I said earlier, what goes out the window? Well, shared relationship and the future. Well, the ego also can't see and validate and praise the other person, which is exactly what they need. We forget because we're hooked or we're upset or we disagree that the other person is, if you're a spiritual person, a child of God, or the other person, has extraordinary potential, or the other person has been through a lot in their life, or the other person is struggling. And we forget that people actually need a lot of encouragement. And I know being in GrowthDay, you tend to be the person who is more encouraging in your relationships. We know that from our research. You tend to be the person who's usually more of the optimist or more of the leader position, that you're the person who's supportive of others, more kind of others, and yes, more encouraging of others. But we forget that when we're angry. Who's guilty? Okay, a few of us. Think about the last argument you had with somebody. Did you praise them? Did you encourage them to share? Did you say a kind word? Did you appreciate something about them? Most people don't. They're on the attack. They're on the offensive. They think they are at war and they must win at all costs. That's the ego. That's narcissism. That's sociopathy. You know what it is it's saying, I must destroy this person because it's a zero-sum game. Either they're evil and I'm good, or I'm right and they are wrong, and there is no in between. And what that does is it objectifies the other person into the category of darkness and bad versus recognizing human frailty, human suffering. It strips us away from that common humanity. And if we let that happen with every conflict situation, no wonder we live in a divisive world where it's accusatory, where it's blaming, where it's the worst assumption about the other person. When in reality, what we really need to do is remember the human struggle, remember their humanity. You know, I know you all know this being GrowthDay members, but an encouraging word to somebody at the right time can change their lives. Let me ask this to you. Do you believe that it is true that some point in your life, somebody gave you some encouragement, maybe some praise, validation, respect, appreciation, honor? They kind of told you were capable and it changed your life. Did that ever happen for anybody here? Ever? When someone encourages you, it changes your life. Well, then can't you get to the logical conclusion that if you encourage somebody in a conflict situation, it could change the tone and outcome of the conflict? If a simple piece of encouragement can change someone's life, couldn't a simple piece of encouragement change the outcome of conflict? Boom, everything changes. The second you get that, like, whoa, encouraging another person in conflict could change the outcome, make them feel respected, make them believe in themselves, make them feel honored, make them feel appreciated, make them feel heard, make them feel validated in some way, even if at the content or topic level you disagree. This changes everything. When you can encourage another human and still debate a topic, now you're a mature adult. Before that, you're screwed. Forgive my language. Before that, you're locked into unconscious immaturity. And I don't say that flippantly. We've all been there. We've all lost our stuff in a conflict situation. We've all said things we regret. I'll remind you, no one here is trying to be perfect in GrowthDay. Our job is to prompt you with new ideas, new phrases, new mindset, new ways of thinking about things. But just think about this. The next time you're going to go have a strong or difficult or conflictual conversation with your partner or your spouse or someone you're in relationship with intimately, imagine if you just said, okay, we have a shared future together. I'm going to respect him or her in this process. And I'm going to make sure I encourage them a little bit. If you did those three things, if you entered it from those three frames, a very different energy happens in that relationship, a very different one. So a lot of these themes are going to come up. That was literally my first point. So that was all of that was my first point, which is the three primary phrases: shared future mindset, making sure we have a respectful process, and encouraging other. This will change everything. This can be your day for personal growth. This can be that day you committed to and you remember and you go, that was the day I got myself a community. I got better coaches. I committed to making my life the absolute best that I could. This is that day. Make today your growth day. Click the button on this page and sign up right now.